A pastor was ridiculed and publicly humiliated, but an incredible miracle happened that left everyone in shock. The morning sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows of Grace Community Church, casting a kaleidoscope of colors across the vast sanctuary. David Williams stood at his polished wooden pulpit, gazing out at the sea of 15,000 faces before him. The megachurch he had built from the ground up over the past decade was a testament to his charismatic leadership and unwavering vision, or at least, that's what everyone believed. Love one another. His voice resonated through the state-of-the-art sound system, filling every corner of the modern cathedral-like structure. But more importantly, serve one another. The congregation hung on his every word, notebooks open, phones recording his every gesture. From the outside, it was the picture of spiritual success, the American megachurch dream realized. At 45 years old, David cut an impressive figure in his tailored suit, his silver-streaked dark hair and warm brown eyes, projecting both authority and approachability. The gold wedding band on his finger caught the light as he gesticulated, a symbol of his seemingly perfect marriage to Sarah, his wife of 20 years and the church's beloved music director. But beneath the polished surface, hairline cracks were beginning to show. David felt them in the quiet moments between sermons, in the late-night board meetings, and in the growing distance between him and Sarah. The pressure of maintaining the image of perfection was becoming unbearable. After the service, Marcus Reynolds, a board member with sharp features and calculating eyes, approached David in his office. "Remarkable sermon today, Pastor," Marcus said, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "The building fund is growing impressively. We're well on track for the new youth center." David nodded, suppressing the unease that always arose during conversations about church finances. The youth center was Marcus's pet project, one that had raised questions among other board members about its necessity and cost. "God has blessed us abundantly," David replied diplomatically. Marcus lingered, his presence heavy with unspoken tension. "Indeed, he has, though I couldn't help but notice some concerns about the allocation of recent donations." The way he emphasized concerns made David's stomach tighten. "Perhaps we should discuss this in detail during Tuesday's board meeting," David suggested, maintaining his composed exterior while his heart raced. Marcus nodded curtly and left, leaving behind a cloud of unspoken threats. Later that evening, in the quietness of his church office, David scrolled through his emails, his concern growing with each message. Anonymous complaints about financial transparency, questions about the building fund, and veiled accusations about his lifestyle. One email in particular caught his attention, from a former church member named Thomas Carter. "Pastor Williams, your empire of lies is built on sand. The truth will come out. Every Sunday you preach about integrity while living a lie. Watch your back." David's hands trembled as he deleted the email. Thomas Carter. The name brought back memories of a bitter disagreement 6 months ago. Thomas had been a devoted member until David had refused to support his controversial youth ministry proposal, which had seemed more focused on political activism than spiritual growth. Thomas had left the church dramatically, making vague accusations about corruption. Sarah's voice interrupted his thoughts. "David, the dinner with the Morrison family is in an hour." She stood in the doorway, elegant in her designer dress, but her eyes held a weariness that makeup couldn't conceal. Their marriage had become more performance than partnership, both of them playing their roles in the grand production that was Grace Community Church. "Of course," he smiled, closing his laptop. "The new potential donors, right?" "Major donors," Sarah corrected, her tone carrying a hint of reproach. "They're considering a 7-figure commitment to the youth center." As they drove their luxury SUV to the upscale restaurant where they would meet the Morrisons, David caught glimpses of his reflection in the windows of passing buildings. Who was this man in expensive clothes, driving an expensive car, living an increasingly expensive lie? When had the simple joy of serving God become buried under the weight of maintaining this massive institution? The dinner was a carefully choreographed affair. The Morrisons, a power couple in their 60s, were exactly the type of donors the church needed. Wealthy, influential, and eager to be associated with Nashville's fastest-growing congregation. David played his part perfectly, sharing vision statements and growth projections, while Sarah charmed them with stories of the church's community impact. Yet throughout the evening, Thomas Carter's email haunted him. "Your empire of lies is built on sand." The words echoed in his mind as he described plans for the youth center, conscious of Marcus Reynolds' watchful gaze from across the restaurant where he sat with his own dinner party. After the Morrisons left, promising to pray about their potential donation, Sarah turned to David. "You seem distracted tonight," she observed, stirring her untouched dessert. "Just tired," he replied automatically, the well-worn excuse falling easily from his lips. "The Sunday services take a lot out of me." Sarah's eyes met his, and for a moment he saw a flash of the young woman he had fallen in love with 2 decades ago, when their dreams had been simple and pure. "When was the last time we actually talked, David? Really talked?" The question hung between them, heavy with years of unspoken words. Before he could answer, his phone buzzed, another email from Thomas Carter. His blood ran cold as he read the message. "I have proof, Pastor. God's light exposes all darkness. You have 1 week to confess, or everyone will see the truth." David closed the email quickly, but not before Sarah caught the look of panic on his face. "What is it?" she asked, her voice sharp with concern and suspicion. "Nothing," he lied, forcing a smile. "Just some administrative details for tomorrow." As they drove home in silence, David's mind raced. What proof did Thomas think he had? The building fund allocations had been aggressive, yes, and perhaps some of the church's financial decisions hadn't been entirely transparent, but everything was legal, wasn't it? The next morning, during his prayer time in the empty sanctuary, David found himself staring at the massive cross suspended above the stage. The early morning light caught the polished metal, creating a glare that made him squint. "Lord," he whispered, his voice echoing in the vacant space, "when did I lose my way?" The answer came not in a divine whisper, but in the click of dress shoes on marble. Marcus Reynolds appeared from the shadows, his face grave. "Pastor, we need to talk about Thomas Carter." David's heart stopped. "What about him?" "He's been asking questions, digging into our records. He's convinced there are irregularities in the building fund. He's threatening to go to the press." "There's nothing to find," David insisted, but even as he spoke, doubt crept into his voice. Marcus's smile was cold. "Of course not. But perception is everything, isn't it? One hint of scandal, one suggestion of impropriety, and everything we've built could crumble. The board is concerned about protecting the church's reputation." The threat was clear. The board would protect the church's reputation, with or without David. As Marcus walked away, his footsteps echoing through the sanctuary, David felt the first tremors of his world beginning to shake. Later that day, as he prepared for a staff meeting, David caught a glimpse of Thomas Carter in the church parking lot, filming something on his phone. Their eyes met through the window, and Thomas smiled, not the angry smile of a bitter ex-member, but the satisfied grin of someone who held all the cards. The empire of lies built on sand was about to face a storm, and David Williams, the charismatic pastor of Grace Community Church, was standing directly in its path. As he watched Thomas drive away, he realized that the hairline cracks in his perfect life were about to break wide open, and not even his impressive oratory skills could prevent the coming collapse. The weight of it all, the pressure, the secrets, the performance, suddenly felt suffocating. David loosened his tie, his designer watch catching the light, a reminder of how far he had come from his humble beginnings as a small-town preacher, or perhaps how far he had fallen. "Lord," he prayed again, this time with genuine desperation, "help me find my way back to the truth." But as he spoke these words, even he wasn't sure what that truth would cost him, or who he would be once it came to light. The morning David Williams saw his world collapse began like any other. He was in his office at Grace Community Church, reviewing his sermon notes for the upcoming Sunday service, when his phone erupted with notifications. At first, he dismissed them as the usual social media activity that accompanied his morning devotional posts. But then Sarah burst through his office door, her face ashen. "David, have you seen it?" Her voice trembled as she held out her tablet. "It's everywhere." His heart sinking, David took the device and pressed play on the video that was already spreading like wildfire across social media. The footage was grainy but clear enough to be devastating. It showed him in what appeared to be a compromising position with a young woman in his office, followed by scenes that suggested financial impropriety, him accepting envelopes of cash and engaging in what looked like secretive transactions. But David's blood ran cold as he recognized the clever manipulation. The footage of him comforting a young woman during a counseling session had been edited and spliced with completely unrelated scenes of him handling donations for the church's homeless outreach program. Thomas Carter had taken moments of legitimate ministry and twisted them into something sinister. "This isn't what it looks like," he said to Sarah, his voice hoarse. "That footage is from months ago, the counseling session with Amanda Richards after her father's suicide, and the donation count for the homeless shelter. Thomas has edited it to make it look, God, Sarah, you have to believe me. Sarah's eyes were filled with tears, but there was something else there too, doubt. Then why does it look so convincing, David? And who's Thomas? Before he could respond, Marcus Reynolds appeared in the doorway, his face grave but his eyes gleaming with an unsettling satisfaction. Pastor Williams, the board is calling an emergency meeting, and you might want to see this. He held up his phone, showing a local news website. The headline made David's stomach lurch. Prominent pastor caught in scandal. Sex, money and corruption at Grace Community Church. The media is already running with the story, Marcus continued, his tone professionally concerned, but with an undercurrent of triumph. We've received calls from 3 major networks and the video has over 1 million views. David's mind raced. We need to release a statement explaining the manipulation. I can prove when those original videos were taken. We have security footage, timestamps. The board feels it would be best if you stepped back from all public communication for now, Marcus interrupted smoothly. We need to handle this delicately. Sarah had moved away from David, standing closer to the door. Her physical withdrawal felt like a knife to his heart. Sarah, please, he pleaded. You know me, you know I would never. Do I? She whispered. Lately, I'm not sure I know you at all. The late nights, the secret meetings, the changes in the building fund allocations. Those were all legitimate church business, David protested, but he could see his words weren't reaching her. The seeds of doubt had been planted too deep. His phone buzzed again, a text from Thomas Carter. Watch it all burn, Pastor. God's justice comes to all. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of accusations, denials, and devastating revelations. The local media dug deeper, uncovering questions about the church's financial records that even David hadn't been aware of. He discovered that Marcus had been manipulating the books for years, creating a paper trail that made it appear as though David had been embezzling funds. The congregation, once 15,000 strong, dwindled to barely 100 faithful members. Social media exploded with hashtags calling for his resignation. Former church members came forward with their own stories, some true but taken out of context, others completely fabricated but eagerly believed by a public hungry for scandal. 1 week after the video surfaced, Sarah left. She packed her bags while David was meeting with the church's lawyers, leaving only a note. I can't live with the doubt anymore. The evidence is too overwhelming. I'm filing for divorce. David sat alone in their empty house that night, surrounded by the trappings of his success that now felt like monuments to his failure. The truth about Marcus's manipulation and Thomas's revenge had finally emerged, but it was too late. The damage was done and the narrative was set in stone. The final blow came during a board meeting 2 weeks after the initial video. David sat at the end of the conference table, watching as his dream crumbled around him. Marcus presented a detailed report of financial irregularities, all carefully crafted to implicate David while obscuring his own guilt. In light of these findings, Marcus concluded, the board has no choice but to accept Pastor Williams's resignation, effective immediately. Resignation? David stood, his voice shaking with anger. I haven't resigned, and these allegations are false. Marcus, you know what you've done. David, one of the older board members interrupted gently, please don't make this more difficult than it needs to be. Think of the church. Think of the healing that needs to begin. As David looked around the table, he saw faces that had once smiled at him in fellowship, now turned away in shame or judgment. Only one person, an elderly deacon named James, met his eyes with sympathy and understanding. After the meeting, James approached David in the parking lot. I know something's not right here, he said quietly, but the truth won't matter now. They've made up their minds. You need to leave Nashville, son. Find somewhere to heal, to rediscover who you are without all this. He pressed an envelope into David's hand. It's not much, but it should help you start over. That night, David packed a single suitcase with essential items. As he prepared to leave the city that had been his home for over a decade, he received one final text from Thomas. Now you know how it feels to lose everything. My daughter's death after you rejected her cry for help destroyed me. This is your penance. The message hit David like a physical blow. He remembered Thomas's daughter, a troubled teen who had sought counseling, whom he had referred to a professional therapist following church protocol. He hadn't known she had taken her own life, and the weight of that knowledge, combined with everything else, brought him to his knees. God, he prayed, tears streaming down his face. I don't understand, but I trust you. Show me the way forward. As dawn broke over Nashville, David Williams, once the celebrated pastor of one of the largest churches in Tennessee, drove away from the city with nothing but a suitcase of clothes, a few $100s from James, and a shattered reputation. The media trucks parked outside his house would find him gone, leaving behind the empire he had built and the life he had known. On the highway heading east, David noticed a small wooden cross on a hillside. It was simple, weathered, and real, everything his life at Grace Community Church had ceased to be. As the sun rose behind it, he felt a strange sense of peace. Perhaps he thought this was not just an ending but also a beginning. What he didn't know was that his journey was far from over, and that in a small, struggling rural community, his true calling awaited. The road ahead would be harder than anything he had faced before, but it would lead him to a deeper understanding of faith, service, and redemption than he had ever known in his days of prosperity and success. The morning sun cast long shadows through the downtown Nashville law office as David Williams sat across from Sarah's attorney, the divorce papers laid out before him like a final judgment. The leather chair that would have once felt luxurious now seemed to mock his fall from grace. 3 weeks had passed since the viral video had destroyed his reputation, and the collapse of his life continued with ruthless efficiency. "Mr. Williams," Sarah's attorney spoke with practiced neutrality, "in light of the ongoing investigations into the church's finances, my client is seeking a complete separation of assets. She's also requesting that you assume full responsibility for any legal liabilities that may arise from the financial improprieties at Grace Community Church." David's own lawyer, a young man named Michael Chen, who had agreed to represent him despite the scandal, leaned forward. "My client maintains his innocence regarding the financial allegations. We have evidence suggesting systematic manipulation by Marcus Reynolds, evidence that conveniently appeared after the fact," Sarah's attorney interrupted. "Mrs. Williams has provided detailed documentation of unusual financial transactions dating back 3 years. The board's investigation has been quite thorough." David's hands trembled as he reached for the glass of water before him. The investigation had indeed been thorough, thoroughly corrupt. Marcus Reynolds had spent years building a paper trail that implicated David while concealing his own embezzlement. The truth was buried under layers of fabricated documents and manipulated records. "Sarah," David spoke directly to his wife, who sat rigid and distant across the table, "you know this isn't true. 20 years of marriage, you know who I am." Sarah finally met his gaze, her eyes hard with hurt and betrayal. "Do I, David? Because the man I married wouldn't have hidden bank accounts in the Cayman Islands." "What?" David's shock was genuine. "I don't have any offshore accounts, that's absurd. We have the documentation," Sarah's attorney stated, sliding across several papers. "Accounts opened under shell corporations linked to your social security number. The deposits correlate perfectly with major donations to the church's building fund." David stared at the documents in horror. Marcus's manipulation went deeper than he had imagined. He turned to Michael, who was already scanning the papers with a frown. "This is the first we're seeing of these accounts," Michael said. "We'll need time to investigate." "Time isn't going to change the facts," Sarah interrupted, her voice breaking. "I've already spoken to the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. They're launching a formal investigation next week." The words hit David like a physical blow. The FBI. This wasn't just about losing his church anymore. He was facing potential criminal charges. His mind raced back to all the documents he had signed over the years, trusting Marcus to handle the details while he focused on ministry. "Sarah, please," he tried one last time. "Remember when we started the church? It was just 20 people in our living room. Everything we built was for God's glory. I would never—" "Stop," Sarah held up her hand. "Just stop. I've heard enough sermons, David. I want the truth." "This is the truth." David's voice rose in frustration. "Marcus Reynolds set me up. Thomas Carter wanted revenge. They worked together to destroy everything we built." "And what about the woman in the video?" Sarah's question cut through his protests like a knife. "That was Amanda Richards. You know her, the grieving daughter I was counseling. The video was edited." "I spoke to Amanda," Sarah said quietly. "She refuses to make any statement defending you. In fact, she won't speak about you at all. What am I supposed to think about that?" David fell silent. He knew why Amanda wouldn't speak. Marcus had gotten to her somehow, the same way he had gotten to so many others. The meeting continued in a blur of legal terms and accusations. When it was over, David stood in the parking lot, watching Sarah drive away in the car they had once shared. His phone buzzed with a news alert. Another story about the scandal, this time featuring interviews with former church members claiming financial misconduct. He opened his banking app only to find his accounts frozen. The church's board had moved quickly to protect their interests, leaving him with access only to his personal savings account, which was rapidly dwindling under the weight of legal fees. That evening, alone in the small apartment he had rented after moving out of their house, David received a visit from James, the elderly deacon who had stood by him. "Son," James said, settling heavily into a chair, "it's worse than we thought. The FBI isn't just looking at the finances. They're investigating possible mail fraud, wire fraud, and tax evasion. Marcus Reynolds disappeared 2 days ago, cleaned out his accounts and vanished." David laughed bitterly. "Of course he did. He set everything up to point to me, and now he's gone." "There's more," James continued. "Thomas Carter was found dead in his apartment this morning. Apparent suicide. He left a note." David's blood ran cold. "What did it say?" "It was rambling, mostly about his daughter, but he mentioned you, said he'd finished what he started." David, with him gone, there's no way to prove the video was manipulated. The walls seemed to close in around David. Thomas's death would be seen as further proof of his guilt, a convenient silence from someone who knew too much. "What do I do now?" David whispered, more to himself than to James. The old man leaned forward, his eyes filled with compassion. "You run. Not because you're guilty, but because you can't fight this. Not here. Not now. They've taken everything. Let them have it. Go somewhere new, somewhere you can find yourself again. And do what? My reputation is destroyed. No church will ever hire me again." "Maybe that's not what God has planned for you," James suggested. "Maybe he's stripping everything away so you can find a new purpose." Later that night, after James had gone, David knelt in his sparse apartment. The news played silently on his laptop. More stories about the scandal, more accusations, more destruction of everything he had built. "Lord," he prayed, his voice breaking, "I don't understand, but I submit. Show me the way." His phone rang, an unknown number. It was a reporter from a national news network, asking for comment on new allegations that had surfaced. David ended the call without speaking. He looked around the apartment, at the few possessions he had left, at the life that had crumbled around him. James was right. There was nothing left for him here. He packed his car that night, taking only what would fit in the trunk. As he drove out of Nashville in the pre-dawn hours, he passed Grace Community Church one last time. The building loomed in the darkness, its empty windows staring back at him like accusing eyes. The highway stretched before him, leading away from everything he had known. He had no destination in mind, no plan beyond escape. But as the sun began to rise, painting the sky in shades of hope, David felt a strange peace settle over him. He was leaving behind more than just a failed ministry and a broken marriage. He was leaving behind the man he had become, the polished performer, the leader more concerned with appearance than substance. Somewhere ahead, a new path awaited. He just had to be brave enough to find it. What he didn't know then was that his journey would lead him to a place where true ministry had nothing to do with building funds or congregation sizes. A place where broken people helped heal each other, and where the power of God worked not through impressive facilities and professional productions, but through humble service and genuine love. The collapse was complete, but in the ruins of his former life, the seeds of something authentic were about to take root. The small rural town of Cedar Grove materialized out of the morning mist like a forgotten memory. After 3 days of aimless driving, David Williams found himself drawn to this weathered community, nestled in the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. The "Welcome to Cedar Grove, population 872" sign was faded and tilted slightly, much like the town itself. His once luxurious SUV, now dusty from the journey, drew curious glances from locals as he pulled into the only gas station in town. The digital display on his bank account app showed a balance that made his stomach clench. $3,412, all that remained of his savings after the legal fees, and 3 days on the road. "You look lost, stranger," a voice called out as he filled his tank. The speaker was an elderly woman with silver hair and keen eyes who introduced herself as Rose Martinez. She stood by an old pickup truck that had seen better days, but her presence carried a dignity that transcended her humble appearance. "Just passing through," David replied automatically, the practiced smile feeling foreign on his tired face. Rose studied him with penetrating eyes that seemed to see right through his facade. "No, you're not," she said simply. "You've got that look about you. Running from something, but maybe God led you here to stop running." David's hands froze on the gas pump. In his casual clothes and 3-day stubble, he looked nothing like the polished megachurch pastor he'd once been, yet something in Rose's words struck uncomfortably close to home. "I'm not," he began, but Rose cut him off with a gentle wave. "Save your story for when you're ready to tell it," she said. "For now, if you're looking for a place to stay, Mrs. Peterson rents rooms above the hardware store. Tell her Rose sent you." With that, she climbed into her truck and drove away, leaving David to ponder her words. The hardware store turned out to be a 2-story brick building that had witnessed at least a century of Cedar Grove's history. Martha Peterson, a widow in her 70s, showed him to a sparse but clean room on the 2nd floor. The rent was reasonable, $200 a month, utilities included. "Bathrooms shared with the other tenant," she explained, "but he's hardly ever here. Works at the lumber mill." She paused, studying David with the same discerning look Rose had given him. "Rose called ahead about you, said you might need some time to find your feet." David felt a surge of emotion at this simple act of kindness from strangers. "Thank you," he managed, his voice rough. "I appreciate it. Church is on Sundays at 10, Martha added as she turned to leave. "Rose leads the worship. Small congregation, but genuine folks." The mention of church sent a spike of anxiety through David's chest. I'm not sure I'm ready for church," he admitted. Martha's expression softened. "Nobody's going to force you, honey. But sometimes the best place to heal is among the broken." Over the next few days, David began to discover the rhythm of Cedar Grove. The town had seen better days. Empty storefronts lined the main street, and poverty was evident in the patched roofs and aging vehicles. Yet there was a resilience to the community, a stubborn determination to survive despite economic hardship. He found work at Joey's Diner, washing dishes and helping in the kitchen. Joey, a gruff man with calloused hands and a perpetual 5 o'clock shadow, didn't ask for references or a background check. "Rose vouched for you," he said simply. "That's good enough for me." The work was physically demanding and paid minimum wage, but David found an unexpected peace in the simple routine. His hands, once used to gesture dramatically from behind a pulpit, now scrubbed pots and chopped vegetables. The hot water and soap washed away more than just food residue. They seemed to cleanse something in his soul. One evening, after a particularly long shift, David walked through town, his feet carrying him to an abandoned building at the edge of the community. The structure had obviously once been important, perhaps a community center or small factory, but now stood empty, its windows boarded up and its walls covered in fading paint. As he stood there studying the building, he heard footsteps behind him. It was Rose carrying a bag of groceries. "Used to be the town's community center," she said, following his gaze. "Closed down 5 years ago when the mill laid off half its workers. The town couldn't afford to keep it running." David walked closer to the building, peering through a gap in the boards. Despite its deterioration, the structure seemed sound. "What happened to the town?" he asked. Rose sighed. "Same thing that happened to many small towns. Factory closures, young people moving away. Opioid crisis hit us hard. We've got folks struggling with addiction, homelessness, despair. Church does what it can, but..." She trailed off, shaking her head. David found himself walking around the building, his mind automatically assessing its potential. The pastor in him, the part he'd been trying to suppress, saw possibilities. "Sometimes," Rose said quietly, watching him, "God puts us exactly where we need to be, even if it's not where we thought we'd end up." David turned to her, a question forming on his lips, but she continued before he could speak. "I know who you are, David Williams. News travels, even to small towns like Cedar Grove. But you know what? We've all got stories. We've all got pasts. What matters is what you do with your present." The shock of being recognized must have shown on his face, because Rose smiled gently. "Don't worry, most folks here either don't know or don't care about Nashville scandals. We've got our own problems to deal with." Looking at the abandoned building, then back at Rose, David felt something stirring in his heart, something he'd thought had died in Nashville. "This building," he said slowly, "how much would it cost to buy it?" Rose's eyes sparkled. "Town owns it now. They'd probably sell it for a song, considering it's just sitting here collecting dust. Why, got an idea?" David nodded, his mind already racing with possibilities. "Maybe, but I'd need help. A lot of help." "Well," Rose said, shifting her grocery bag to her other arm, "that's one thing we've got plenty of in Cedar Grove, people willing to help each other. When you're ready to share your idea, let me know." As Rose walked away, David stood in the growing dusk, staring at the abandoned building. For the first time since leaving Nashville, he felt a spark of purpose. This wasn't about building another megachurch or restoring his reputation. This was about something more basic, more genuine, helping people who needed it. He pulled out his phone and looked at his bank balance again. $3,412 wouldn't go far, but maybe it would be enough to start something. Something real this time, without the glitz and glamour of his previous life. As he walked back to his rented room, David passed several people he'd come to recognize over the past few days. The tired mill workers heading home, the young mother struggling with grocery bags and 3 kids, the elderly man who spent his days in front of the convenience store. These were the people he'd been called to serve, he realized. Not the wealthy suburbanites of Nashville, but the forgotten people of places like Cedar Grove. That night, for the first time since the scandal broke, David knelt in genuine prayer, not out of habit or obligation, but from a place of true humility. "Lord," he whispered, "I think I understand now. Show me how to serve these people. Show me how to make this right." The answer wasn't a thunderbolt from heaven or a miraculous sign. Instead, it was the quiet certainty that he was exactly where he needed to be. Cedar Grove, with its broken buildings and resilient people, would be the place where David Williams would either find redemption or face final failure, and somehow that knowledge brought him peace. The early morning sunlight filtered through the dusty windows of the abandoned community center as David stood in what had once been the main hall. 2 weeks had passed since his conversation with Rose, and after numerous meetings with the town council, he had managed to purchase the building for a mere $2,000, a price that reflected both its dilapidated state and the council's eagerness to see it put to good use. "It's going to need a lot of work," said Mike Henderson, a local contractor who had agreed to assess the building's condition. His weathered face creased with concern as he examined the walls. "Foundation's solid, but you've got plumbing issues, electrical needs updating, and there's probably asbestos in some of these older sections." David nodded, making notes on a worn notepad. His remaining funds, barely $1,400, wouldn't cover even a fraction of the necessary repairs. But something told him this was where he needed to start. "How much to make it safe and functional?" he asked. "Not pretty, just usable." Mike scratched his chin thoughtfully. "If we focus on the main hall and 2 smaller rooms, maybe 15,000. That's with me doing it at cost and assuming we can get volunteers to help with the basic work." The number might as well have been $1 million for all David could afford, but before he could respond, Rose's voice echoed through the empty building. "We'll figure it out," she said, walking in with a group of people behind her. "Cedar Grove takes care of its own." David turned to see an unlikely collection of townspeople: Joey from the diner, Martha Peterson, several mill workers he recognized as regular customers, and even a few faces he didn't know. "Words got around about what you're trying to do here," Rose explained. "These folks want to help." A tall, broad-shouldered man stepped forward. "I'm Tom Watson, foreman at the lumber mill. We can donate some materials. Won't be top grade, but it'll be sturdy." Others chimed in, offers of labor, supplies, and expertise. David felt overwhelmed by their generosity, especially given his past. These people knew nothing about him except that he was trying to help their community, and that seemed to be enough for them. Work began the following day. The first task was clearing out years of accumulated debris and cleaning every surface that could be cleaned. Volunteers arrived in waves, before their shifts at the mill, after closing time at the diner, whenever they could spare an hour or 2. David worked alongside them, his hands blistering from unfamiliar labor. He learned to patch drywall from Mike, to replace broken windows from Tom's crew, and to repair basic plumbing from a retired handyman named George. Every skill he acquired felt like a step away from his former life of delegating tasks to paid professionals. As they worked, stories began to emerge. Martha shared how her late husband had taught woodworking classes in one of the rooms they were renovating. Joey remembered basketball games in the gym that was now filled with broken equipment. The building held the community's memories, and with each repair, they were breathing life back into those memories. One morning, about 3 weeks into the renovation, a young woman arrived at the site. She looked barely 20, with hollow eyes and track marks on her arms that she tried to hide with long sleeves despite the summer heat. I heard you're going to help people here," she said hesitantly. "People like me?" David set down his paintbrush and approached her carefully. "That's the plan," he said gently. "What's your name?" "Jenny," she whispered. "I want to get clean, but the nearest rehab center is 2 hours away and I can't afford it." David felt the familiar weight of responsibility, but this time It was different from his days at Grace Community Church. This wasn't about maintaining an image or meeting donation goals. This was about one person standing right in front of him, asking for help. "We're not ready yet," he admitted, "but if you want to help us get ready, you're welcome to stay and work with us. We can figure out the rest together." Jenny stayed. Rose helped her find a room at Martha's place, and Joey offered her a job washing dishes, the same job he'd given David. Slowly, her hands steadied, and her eyes began to show signs of life again. Word spread through the community's shadows. More people started showing up. Addicts seeking recovery, homeless individuals looking for shelter, teenagers with nowhere else to go. David couldn't offer them professional treatment or fancy programs, but he could offer them work, purpose, and community. The renovation project became more than just fixing a building. It became a recovery program in itself. People found healing in the physical labor, in the sense of accomplishment as walls were repaired and rooms restored. They shared their stories over lunch breaks, formed bonds as they painted together, and supported each other through withdrawal symptoms and emotional breakdowns. "This isn't how I imagined it," David confessed to Rose one evening as they sat on the building's front steps watching the sunset. "In Nashville, everything was about programs and procedures. Here, it's just people helping people." Rose smiled. "Sometimes that's all ministry really is, David, just being present with people in their pain." The work wasn't without its challenges. Money was constantly tight, despite donations from local businesses and churches. Some volunteers relapsed and disappeared, though many returned, ashamed but determined to try again. The town council had questions about permits and regulations, though they generally looked the other way when David couldn't afford all the proper paperwork. One day, as David was installing new light fixtures with Mike's guidance, Jenny appeared in the doorway, holding a local newspaper. Her hands were shaking, but her eyes were clear. "David," she said, "you need to see this." The paper featured a small article about their work, comparing the center's grassroots approach to addiction recovery with more traditional programs. It was mostly positive, but it included a brief mention of David's past in Nashville, describing him as a disgraced former megachurch pastor seeking redemption. David felt his heart sink, waiting for the questions, the doubt, the rejection. But Jenny just folded the paper and met his gaze. "I don't care who you were," she said firmly. "I care who you are now. And who you are now helped save my life." Her words struck him deeply. Who he was now, a man with calloused hands and a humble heart, working alongside broken people to create something meaningful. It wasn't the life he'd imagined for himself, but somehow it felt more real than anything he'd built in Nashville. As summer turned to fall, the community center began to take shape. The main hall became a meeting space for support groups. One of the smaller rooms was converted into a simple kitchen where Joey taught cooking classes. Another became a classroom where Martha offered GED tutoring. The building was far from perfect. The paint job was patchy, the furniture was all donated and mismatched, and the heating system made strange noises. But it was alive with purpose, filled with people seeking hope and finding it in unexpected places. One evening, after a particularly successful group session, David found himself alone in the main hall. The sound of distant laughter drifted in from the kitchen, where Jenny was teaching other recovering addicts how to bake bread, a skill she'd learned from Joey. Looking around at the imperfect beauty of what they'd created, David remembered the polished perfection of Grace Community Church. The contrast couldn't have been starker, but he finally understood what had been missing in Nashville: authenticity. Here, in this humble building with its mismatched chairs and patched walls, people were finding genuine healing. They weren't coming for professional counseling or polished sermons. They were coming because they found love, acceptance, and purpose. As he turned out the lights and locked up for the night, David whispered a prayer of gratitude. The building wasn't finished. Perhaps it never would be. But like the people it served, it was a work in progress, being restored one day at a time. The autumn air carried a bitter chill as David stood on the community center's newly repaired front steps, watching dark clouds gather on the horizon. Weather reports had been warning of an unprecedented storm system moving towards Cedar Grove, but few in the small town had paid much attention. They were used to nature's temperamental moods. Inside the center, life continued as usual. Jenny, now 6 months clean, was leading a support group for other recovering addicts. The sound of their honest discussions filtered through the thin walls, a reminder of how far they'd come since those first uncertain days. David's phone buzzed. A text from Rose. "Turn on the news. Now." He walked to the small office he'd carved out of a former storage closet and clicked on the ancient television they'd salvaged from a yard sale. The local news channel showed radar images that made his heart skip. A massive system of storms, far more severe than initially predicted, was bearing down on their region. "We're looking at potential rainfall of 15 to 20 inches within 24 hours, the meteorologist was saying, her voice tense with concern. "Flash flooding is almost certain, and with the ground already saturated from recent rains." David's mind raced. The community center sat near Cedar Creek, which had always seemed harmless enough, but with that much rain. He grabbed his notepad and began making calls. Within an hour, the center's main hall had transformed into an emergency command post. Rose arrived with maps of the town's flood history, while Mike Henderson brought his construction expertise and knowledge of the area's drainage systems. "The mill's on high ground," Tom Watson offered, having rushed over from his shift. "We can use it as an evacuation point if needed." As they planned, David noticed Mark Johnson, his former friend from Nashville, slip quietly into the back of the room. Their eyes met briefly, and David felt a mixture of surprise and wariness. He hadn't seen Mark since leaving Nashville, and his unexpected appearance set off warning bells, but there wasn't time to dwell on it. The first raindrops were already pelting the windows, and they had work to do. "Jenny," David called out to his young protege, "can you start calling everyone in our support groups? Make sure they have a safe place to wait out the storm. If not, tell them to come here." She nodded, already pulling out her phone. The recovery community they'd built was tight-knit. They looked after their own. "I've got the elderly residents on my street," Martha added, her arthritis-gnarled fingers clutching her own list of names, "but some of them don't have transportation." "I'll handle that," Joey volunteered, twirling his truck keys. "Kitchen's stocked too. We can feed people for a few days if we need to." As the afternoon wore on, the storm intensified. The rain fell in sheets, drumming against the roof with increasing fury. David found himself grateful for all the repair work they'd done over the past months. The new roof, the reinforced windows, the updated electrical system. The building that had once been a symbol of the town's decay was now becoming its sanctuary. People began arriving in waves, recovering addicts from their programs, elderly neighbors brought in by Joey, families from the low-lying areas of town. The main hall filled with the murmur of worried conversations and the squeal of children too young to understand the danger. Around sunset, Mark finally approached David, his expression grave. "We need to talk," he said quietly. Privately, they stepped into David's office, the sound of the storm muffled but still present. "What are you doing here, Mark?" David asked, trying to keep the defensiveness out of his voice. "I've been tracking you," Mark admitted. "After everything that happened, I didn't believe the stories about you, David. I've been investigating Marcus Reynolds." David felt his pulse quicken. "And? I found evidence, proof of his manipulation, documentation of the real financial transactions. He's in Argentina, living on the money he stole. I can clear your name." The news should have felt like a triumph, but David found himself strangely unmoved. "Why now?" "Because I saw what you're building here." Mark gestured to the main hall. "This is real ministry, David. The kind we used to talk about before Grace Community Church became what it became. You deserve to have your reputation restored." Before David could respond, a crash of thunder shook the building, and Jenny burst into the office. "David, the creek's rising fast. We've got reports of flooding on Oak Street, and there's a school bus stuck on River Road." The conversation with Mark would have to wait. David rushed out to find the main hall in controlled chaos. Mike was organizing teams to fill sandbags, while Tom coordinated with the mill to open more shelter space. But it was the news about the school bus that chilled David's blood. River Road ran parallel to Cedar Creek, and with the water rising. "How many children?" he demanded. 15, Jenny replied, her face pale. "They were returning from a field trip. Bus driver tried to turn around when he saw the water, but the road's blocked both ways now." David grabbed his rain jacket. "I'm going out there." "David!" "No!" Rose grabbed his arm. "The rescue crews are overwhelmed," he finished. "We've got people here who know these roads, know this creek. We can help." Looking around the room, he saw determination replace fear in many faces. These people had been helping each other for months now. This was just another way to serve. "I'm coming with you," Mark said, stepping forward. "I'm certified in swift water rescue." David nodded, surprised but grateful. Tom offered his heavy-duty truck, and several mill workers volunteered to join them. As they prepared to head out, Jenny caught David's arm. "Promise you'll come back," she said fiercely. "We need you here." The raw honesty in her voice touched him deeply. This wasn't about him being their leader or pastor. It was about family, about community, about the bonds they'd forged through shared struggles and triumphs. "I promise," he replied, meaning it with every fiber of his being. As they stepped out into the storm, David felt the full force of nature's fury. The rain was a solid wall of water, and the wind howled like a living thing. But somewhere out there, children needed help. The reputation he'd lost in Nashville, the scandal that had driven him from his old life, none of it mattered now. What mattered was staying true to the lessons he'd learned in Cedar Grove, that real ministry happened in the midst of life's storms, that true community meant facing dangers together, and that sometimes God's power was most visible not in grand sanctuaries, but in simple acts of courage and love. The truck's headlights cut through the darkness as they headed toward River Road, the storm raging around them. David didn't know what they would find, but he knew they wouldn't face it alone. The real test of his redemption was about to begin, not in the courts of public opinion, but in the rising waters of Cedar Creek. The storm unleashed its full fury as David, Mark, and 3 mill workers navigated Tom's truck through the flooded streets of Cedar Grove. The windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the deluge, and the headlights barely penetrated the darkness. Through the rain-swept windows, they could see Cedar Creek had transformed from a gentle stream into a raging torrent. "There," Mark shouted, pointing through the passenger window. The beam of their spotlight caught the yellow side of a school bus tilted precariously on the flooded road. Water swirled around its wheels, and more was rushing in by the second. David's heart stopped when he saw small faces pressed against the windows. 15 children and their driver were trapped inside, and the water level was rising rapidly. The bus had tried to turn around when the driver saw the flooding, but had slid partially off the road. Now it sat at a dangerous angle, with the rushing water threatening to tip it completely. "We need to get a rope line to them," Mark said, pulling emergency gear from his pack. His swift water rescue training was proving invaluable. "But this current, it's too strong for a direct approach." David studied the scene, his mind racing. The children were scared. He could see them crying even from this distance. Some were holding cell phones up to the windows, their screens creating tiny beacons in the darkness. "There's a maintenance path that runs parallel to the road," said Bill, one of the mill workers. "It's higher ground. We might be able to reach them from there." They carefully maneuvered the truck onto the maintenance path, fighting for traction in the mud. As they got closer to the bus, David could hear the children's screams over the roar of the storm. The water was now halfway up the bus's side. "Dear God," David prayed aloud, "guide us." What happened next would later be described differently by different witnesses, but all agreed it was extraordinary. As David stepped out into the rain, a strange light seemed to emanate from nowhere and everywhere at once. It wasn't like lightning or flashlights. It was a soft, warm glow that cut through the darkness and rain. "What is that?" Mark gasped, but David was already moving. The light seemed to illuminate a path through the chaos, a route to the bus that avoided the deepest and most dangerous parts of the flooding. David could see it clearly, though he couldn't explain how. He grabbed a rescue rope from Mark's gear and began making his way toward the bus. "David, wait!" Mark called out, but his voice was lost in the storm. The water pulled at David's legs as he waded through it, but somehow he maintained his footing. The mysterious light continued to guide him, showing him where to step where the current was weakest. He could hear the others following behind him, setting up a rescue line, but his focus was entirely on reaching the bus. When he finally made it to the bus's emergency door, he found it jammed. The driver, an elderly man named Carl, was trying desperately to force it open from the inside. "Stand back," David shouted over the storm. Using a piece of debris as leverage, he managed to force the door open. The children were huddled together in the higher end of the tilted bus, some crying, others eerily quiet. Their teacher, a young woman David recognized from the community center's tutoring program, was doing her best to keep them calm. "We need to move quickly," David called out. "The water's still rising." Mark had managed to secure a rescue line from the maintenance path to the bus. One by one, they began evacuating the children, using the rope as a guideline. The mysterious light continued to illuminate their way, making it possible to see through the rain and darkness. Several of the children were too scared to move, clinging to their seats in terror. David found himself speaking to them with a calm he didn't know he possessed, his voice carrying clearly despite the storm. "Look at the light," he told them. "Focus on the light. It's showing us the way home." The younger ones seemed to respond instinctively to the warm glow, their fear giving way to wonder. They followed David's instructions without question, making their way along the rescue line to safety. As they worked, the bus groaned ominously. The water was now up to the windows, and the current was growing stronger by the minute. They had managed to evacuate 12 of the 15 children when the bus shifted suddenly, tilting further toward the floodwaters. "We need to get out now," Mark shouted. The remaining 3 children were the youngest, 6-year-old twins and their 7-year-old friend. They were frozen in fear, refusing to move. Their teacher had stayed with them, but David could see the panic in her eyes. Without hesitation, David climbed back into the bus. The floor was now at such an angle that he had to brace himself against the seats. The mysterious light followed him, filling the bus with its reassuring glow. "Do you trust me?" he asked the children. Through their tears, they nodded. "Then let's play a game," he said, forcing a smile. "We're going to be superheroes flying through the storm. But superheroes need to be brave and follow the light. Can you be brave for me?" One of the twins reached out and took his hand, then the other. Their friend followed suit. The teacher gave David a grateful look as she helped guide them toward the emergency door. They were halfway across the rescue line when the bus finally gave way. With a deafening crash, it tipped over completely and was swept into the current. David and the others watched in horror as it was carried downstream, vanishing into the darkness. But they had done it. All 15 children, their teacher, and the bus driver were safe. The mysterious light that had guided them began to fade, but not before dozens of people on the shore had witnessed it. Many had captured videos on their phones, though some would later claim that the light didn't show up in their footage. As they helped the children into waiting vehicles, David heard one of the twins say to her sister, "The angel light showed us the way." Mark grabbed David's arm. "What was that? I've never seen anything like it in all my years of rescue work." David shook his head, water streaming down his face. "I don't know, but I know it saved these children's lives." The journey back to the community center was slow and careful. The storm was still raging, but the mysterious light had left them with a sense of peace that transcended the chaos around them. The children, though wet and shaken, were surprisingly calm, many of them describing the angel light that had helped them. When they finally reached the center, they found it buzzing with activity. News of the rescue had already spread, and parents were arriving to reunite with their children. Jenny had organized dry clothes and hot chocolate, while Joey worked in the kitchen preparing warm meals for everyone. Rose met David at the door, her eyes wide. "The light, people are saying—" "I know," David said quietly. "I don't understand it either, but I know it was real." As he helped coordinate care for the rescued children and their families, David couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought him here. From the polished pulpit of Grace Community Church to wading through floodwaters to save children, it seemed like several lifetimes ago. The storm continued through the night, but the community center became a haven of warmth and safety. The mysterious light had done more than just guide a rescue. It had brought the people of Cedar Grove together in a way that transcended their usual divisions. And somewhere in the chaos, phones were buzzing with videos and messages about the miracle at Cedar Creek, spreading the story far beyond their small town. David's past and future were about to collide in ways he couldn't imagine, but for now, he focused on serving the people around him, grateful for the divine intervention that had made the impossible possible. The miracle of the bus would soon become a story told and retold, but its true impact was in the changes it wrought in the hearts of those who witnessed it, a reminder that sometimes God's power manifests not in grand ceremonies or polished sermons, but in moments of desperate need and simple faith. The morning after the miraculous rescue, Cedar Grove awoke to a transformed landscape. The floodwaters had begun to recede, leaving behind mud-covered streets and debris-strewn yards, but something else had changed in the small town. There was an electric energy in the air, a sense that they had witnessed something extraordinary. David sat in his small office at the community center, watching as national news vans began arriving in town. His phone hadn't stopped buzzing since dawn. The videos of the mysterious light during the bus rescue had gone viral, spreading across social media platforms with unprecedented speed. Some showed the warm, inexplicable glow that had guided them to safety, while others captured only the rain and darkness, a detail that added to the miracle's mystique. Mark knocked on the doorframe, holding out a tablet. "You need to see this," he said. The screen showed a news article from Nashville. The headline read, "Mysterious Light Guides Disgraced Pastor in Heroic Rescue, but there's more to the story." Below it was a photograph of Marcus Reynolds being led away in handcuffs by federal agents in Buenos Aires. "They found him," Mark explained, pulling up a chair. "The evidence I mentioned before? I'd already turned it over to the FBI. They've been tracking him for weeks. The timing is, well, Some might call it divine intervention. David read through the article with trembling hands. Marcus had confessed to everything: the financial manipulation, the falsified documents, the offshore accounts. He had worked with Thomas Carter to create and edit the viral video that had destroyed David's reputation, motivated by greed and revenge after David had started questioning some of his financial decisions. "There's more," Mark continued, scrolling down. "Thomas Carter's suicide note. They've released it." He paused, his voice softening. "He wrote about his daughter, about how grief had poisoned him, but he also wrote about you, David. He admitted to manipulating the video, said the guilt was eating him alive." The truth was finally coming out, but David felt no triumph. Instead, he felt a deep sadness for the broken lives that had led to his own breaking. "Have you heard from Sarah?" he asked quietly. Mark nodded. "She's been trying to reach you. The whole congregation has. The evidence, it's irrefutable. They know now that you were innocent." Before David could respond, Jenny burst into the office. "David!" "The parents of the twins. They want to talk to you, and there are reporters everywhere. They're asking about the light." David stood up, straightening his mud-stained clothes. Through the window, he could see a crowd gathering outside the community center. Former addicts who had found recovery there stood shoulder to shoulder with mill workers and local families, forming a protective barrier between the media and their sanctuary. As he stepped out of his office, Rose met him in the hallway. "The Today Show wants an interview," she said. "So does Good Morning America. They're calling it The Miracle at Cedar Grove." David walked into the main hall where the twins and their parents were waiting. The girls ran to him immediately, wrapping their arms around his legs. "Mr. David," they cried in unison. "We told them about the angel light." Their mother stepped forward, tears in her eyes. "We saw the videos," she said, "but more than that, we saw what you've built here. This center. You've helped so many people. Our community was dying before you came." Their father, a tough-looking man with calloused hands, cleared his throat. "We've been watching the news about your past in Nashville. We want you to know it doesn't matter to us. We know who you are by what you've done here." David felt overwhelmed by their words, by the support of the community he'd grown to love. Through the windows, he could see more people arriving, residents of Cedar Grove coming to stand with him against the media circus that was descending on their town. Joey appeared with a fresh pot of coffee. "They're saying you could go back," he said gruffly. "To Nashville, to your old life. That church of yours. They want you back." The words hung in the air. David's phone buzzed again, another call from his former church's board of directors. They had already issued a public apology, begging for his forgiveness and offering to restore him to his position with full honors. Looking around the community center, at the mismatched furniture and patched walls, at the faces of people who had become family, David knew his answer. This place, with its broken people and humble surroundings, had taught him more about authentic ministry than all his years in Nashville. "The light wasn't just about saving those children," he said finally. "It was about showing us all the way home, and this is home." Rose smiled, unsurprised. "What do you want us to tell the reporters?" David considered for a moment. "Tell them the truth about the light, about this place, about second chances and real redemption. But tell them also that Cedar Grove's story isn't about me. It's about all of us, broken people helping each other heal." As the day progressed, the media attention intensified. Reporters interviewed local residents who shared stories not just of the miraculous rescue, but of the quiet miracles that had been happening at the community center for months. Addicts finding recovery, homeless individuals finding purpose, lonely people finding family. Mark stayed close, helping to manage the media circus while continuing to share updates about the situation in Nashville. Marcus Reynolds' confession had opened a floodgate of revelations about corruption in the megachurch world, sparking a national conversation about authentic faith versus institutional religion. By evening, David found himself sitting on the center's front steps with Jenny, watching as the sunset painted the mud-covered town in shades of gold. "You're not leaving us, are you?" she asked, voicing the fear that many in the community shared. David shook his head. "My life in Nashville was about building an empire," he said. "This place, it's about building people. That light showed us something more important than miracles. It showed us that God's power isn't in big buildings or fancy programs. It's in simple acts of love and service." Jenny leaned her head on his shoulder, and they sat in comfortable silence as the day's last light faded. Behind them, the community center hummed with life, a recovery meeting in one room, a literacy class in another, volunteers organizing supplies for flood cleanup in the main hall. The media would eventually move on to other stories, but the impact of the miracle at Cedar Grove would continue to ripple outward, not just in the viral videos or news reports, but in the changed lives and renewed spirits of a community that had discovered what real ministry looked like. The truth had emerged, not just about David's past, but about the power of authentic faith and genuine community. And in the end, that was the greatest miracle of all. 2 months after the miraculous rescue at Cedar Grove, the autumn leaves painted the small town in vibrant shades of red and gold. The community center, once a symbol of decay, now stood as a beacon of hope, its walls freshly painted and its programs thriving. The national media attention had brought unexpected benefits. Donations had poured in from across the country, allowing for proper repairs and expanded services. David stood in his office, looking at a familiar face across his desk. Sarah, his former wife, who had made the journey from Nashville after weeks of phone conversations and email exchanges. "It's different from what I expected," she said softly, taking in the modest surroundings. Gone were the mahogany furniture and expensive artwork of his Nashville office, replaced by second-hand chairs and walls covered with photos of community events and recovery celebrations. "Everything's different," David replied, his voice gentle. The bitterness that had marked their last encounters had faded, replaced by a quiet understanding. "I'm different." Sarah nodded, fidgeting with her wedding ring. "A new one," David noticed. "I came to apologize," she said. "I should have believed in you, should have stood by you when everything fell apart. I was so caught up in maintaining our image that I forgot about our truth." "We both lost our way," David acknowledged. "The church, the status, the lifestyle, it became more important than the ministry itself. Maybe we needed to lose it all to find what really matters." Through the window, they could see Jenny leading a group of teenagers in a community service project, cleaning up debris that still remained from the flood. Among them were the twins who had been rescued from the bus, now regular volunteers at the center. "The light," Sarah said hesitantly. "Everyone's talking about it. The videos, the witnesses. It's incredible. But what amazes me more is what you've built here. This is real ministry, David. The kind we used to dream about before Grace Community Church became..." She trailed off. "Before it became a business instead of a ministry," David finished. "I know. It took losing everything to understand that God's work isn't about building bigger buildings or attracting larger crowds. It's about transforming lives, one person at a time." A knock at the door interrupted them. Rose entered, carrying a stack of newspapers. "You might want to see these," she said, spreading them out on the desk. The headlines told a story of transformation that went beyond Cedar Grove. "Megachurch movement faces reckoning," declared one. "Return to authentic faith," proclaimed another. The miracle at Cedar Grove had sparked a national conversation about the nature of true ministry and genuine community. "Your old congregation," Sarah said carefully. "They're still hoping you'll come back. The board has offered to step down completely, let you rebuild from scratch." David shook his head. "I'm needed here. Besides, going back would mean trying to rebuild something that God has already shown me needs to stay broken." As if to emphasize his point, they heard laughter from the main hall. Joey was teaching a cooking class to a group of recovering addicts, the smell of fresh bread filling the air. Through the open door, David could see Mark working with a group of volunteers, organizing supplies for their expanding outreach programs. "The media attention has brought more people seeking help," David explained, "not just from Cedar Grove, but from surrounding communities. We're seeing healing happen every day, not through fancy programs or professional counseling, but through people helping people." Sarah stood and walked to the window, watching the activity outside. "You seem at peace," she observed. "Happier than I've seen you in years, even with..." She gestured at the modest surroundings. "Because this is real," David said simply. "Everything we do here matters. Every person who walks through those doors is valuable, not because of what they can contribute, but simply because they're here." Their conversation was interrupted by another knock. Jenny poked her head in, then stopped short when she saw Sarah. "Sorry," she said quickly, "but the Nashville news crew is here for the follow-up story, and that reporter from Time magazine wants to talk about the spiritual renewal movement." David looked at Sarah apologetically, but she was already gathering her purse. "I should go," she said. "My flight back is in a few hours anyway." They walked together to the entrance, passing groups of people engaged in various activities. A literacy class, a support group meeting, elderly residents playing cards with teenagers. The center had become exactly what its name implied, a true center of the community. At the door, Sarah turned to David one last time. "I'm getting married again," she said. "He's a good man, a high school teacher. No mansions or private jets," she added with a small smile, "but he's real." "I'm happy for you," David said, and meant it. "We all deserve second chances." Speaking of which, Sarah reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope. "These came to the house, your old house. They're letters from people at Grace Community Church. Not the board members or big donors, but regular people. They want you to know how your story has affected them, how it's changed their understanding of faith and ministry." David took the envelope, touched by the gesture. "Thank you, not just for these, but for coming, for understanding." After Sarah left, David walked through the center, greeting people by name, listening to their stories and concerns. The light that had appeared during the flood might have been miraculous, but the real miracles were happening every day in small acts of kindness and moments of transformation. In the main hall, Rose was organizing a town meeting to discuss expanding their services. The Baptist Church in Milton asked if we could help them set up a similar program, she told David. "People are starting to understand that this model of ministry, simple, authentic, community-based, is what they've been hungering for." That evening, as the sun set over Cedar Grove, David sat in the small chapel they had created in one of the center's rooms. It wasn't fancy, just a cross on the wall and some salvaged pews, but it was filled with more genuine worship than he had ever experienced in his massive Nashville sanctuary. Jenny found him there, sitting quietly in the gathering darkness. "We got another donation today," she said, "but this one's different. It's from your old church, not the leadership, but the members. They took up a collection to support our work here." David smiled, remembering the envelope of letters Sarah had brought. "God's light shows up in unexpected places," he said. "Sometimes it's a miraculous glow guiding us through a storm. Sometimes it's people finding their way back to authentic faith." "You really aren't going back, are you?" Jenny asked, though she already knew the answer. "This is where I belong," David replied. "This is where God's light led me, and this is where the real work is happening." As they walked out together, the community center was still alive with activity, a testament to the power of genuine ministry and true redemption. The headlines would eventually fade, but the transformation that had begun in Cedar Grove would continue, touching lives and healing hearts in ways that no megachurch empire ever could. David's reputation had been restored, but more importantly, his purpose had been refined. In losing everything, he had found something far more valuable, a genuine calling to serve, not from a polished pulpit, but in the messy, beautiful reality of everyday life. The light that had guided them through the storm had done more than save lives. It had illuminated a path back to authentic faith, not just for David, but for everyone who witnessed it. And in Cedar Grove, that light continued to shine, not as a miraculous glow, but in the transformed lives and renewed spirits of a community that had discovered what true ministry looked like. 1 year after the miraculous rescue at Cedar Creek, Cedar Grove had become a testament to the power of authentic ministry. The community center, once a symbol of the town's decline, now served as the heart of a growing movement that was spreading across the country. David Williams stood at the podium in the main hall, looking out at a gathering that would have been unimaginable just 12 months ago. Representatives from more than 50 churches across America had come to Cedar Grove to learn about what the media had dubbed the Cedar Grove model, a return to grassroots, community-based ministry that focused on genuine transformation rather than numerical growth. The hall was packed, but not with the polished crowd he'd once preached to in Nashville. These were people who had dirt under their fingernails and calluses on their hands, leaders who understood that true ministry often meant getting messy. "Welcome to Cedar Grove," David began, his voice carrying naturally without the need for the sophisticated sound systems of his past. "What you see here isn't a program to be replicated or a system to be implemented. It's simply what happens when broken people come together to help each other heal." The visitors had spent the morning touring the facility, witnessing firsthand the various ministries that had organically developed. They'd seen Joey's culinary training program, which had already helped 20 former addicts find employment in restaurants across the region. They'd visited the education center, where Martha and her team of volunteer teachers had helped 35 adults earn their GED certificates. "A year ago," David continued, "I stood in this same hall, watching floodwaters rise and wondering if we'd survive the night. What happened next made headlines, the mysterious light that guided us to save those children. But the real miracle wasn't the light itself, it was what happened after." He gestured to Jenny, who stood at the back of the room. She had recently celebrated 18 months of sobriety and had become the center's recovery program coordinator. Her transformation was just one of many stories that visitors had heard throughout the day. "The light showed us a path that night," David said, "but it also illuminated a deeper truth. Ministry isn't about building bigger buildings or attracting larger crowds. It's about creating spaces where people can encounter God's love through genuine community and practical support." As he spoke, David could see Rose nodding from her seat in the front row. At 73, she remained the heart and soul of Cedar Grove's transformation, her wisdom and compassion continuing to guide their growing ministry. "Some of you have asked about our programs, our methods, our metrics for success," David continued. "But what we've learned here is that real transformation can't be measured in numbers or documented in quarterly reports. It happens in moments of authentic connection, in the daily acts of service that restore dignity and hope." He shared stories from the past year: the former drug dealer who now ran their food bank, the homeless veteran who had become their maintenance supervisor, the troubled teenagers who had found purpose in helping others. Each story illustrated not just individual transformation, but the power of a community that refused to give up on its members. "The national attention we received after the flood brought resources we desperately needed," David acknowledged. "But money alone doesn't transform lives. What transforms lives is love in action, hope made tangible through practical support and genuine relationships." As if to emphasize his point, the sound of laughter drifted in from the kitchen, where Joey was teaching his latest culinary class. Through the windows, visitors could see volunteers working in the community garden they'd started in spring, growing food for the center's meals and teaching sustainable living skills. "Your churches may be facing different challenges than we faced here in Cedar Grove," David continued. "Your communities may have different needs, but the principle remains the same. Ministry happens best when we stop trying to build religious empires and start building relationships." He shared how the center had become a model for other communities, not through formal programs or structured initiatives, but through organic connections and shared experiences. 5 other towns in the region had started similar centers, each adapting the concept to their unique circumstances. "The light that guided us that night wasn't just about saving lives from a flood," David said, his voice softening. "It was about showing us a different way to do ministry, a way that values authenticity over appearance, service over success, and transformation over numbers." As he concluded his presentation, David invited questions from the audience. The discussion that followed revealed a hunger for authentic ministry that transcended denominational boundaries and theological differences. Leaders shared their own struggles with maintaining massive buildings while their communities suffered, of feeling pressured to focus on attendance numbers rather than genuine transformation. During the lunch break, David found himself speaking with a megachurch pastor from Texas who had tears in his eyes. "I built a $30 million worship center," the man confessed, "but we have homeless people sleeping in our parking lot because we can't figure out how to help them without enabling them. Something's wrong with that picture." "It's never too late to change direction," David replied, thinking of his own journey. "Sometimes losing everything is the beginning of finding what really matters." The afternoon sessions focused on practical aspects of community-based ministry. Jenny led a workshop on addiction recovery, emphasizing the importance of long-term relationship building over short-term programs. Rose shared insights about identifying and nurturing local leadership. Joey demonstrated how practical skills training could become a vehicle for spiritual growth. As the day drew to a close, David led the group in a final session in the small chapel. The space was crowded, with many sitting on the floor, but no one seemed to mind. The simplicity of the room, with its salvaged pews and hand-built cross, spoke volumes about the center's priorities. "A year ago," David concluded, "I thought my ministry was over. My reputation was destroyed, my marriage had ended, and everything I had built was lost. But God had other plans. Through the kindness of this community and the miracle we witnessed, I learned that true ministry often begins when our carefully constructed religious systems fall apart." The impact of Cedar Grove's story continued to spread, not through marketing campaigns or conference presentations, but through changed lives and renewed communities. The national movement it inspired wasn't about copying a model, but about rediscovering the essence of authentic faith and genuine service. As the visitors departed, loaded with ideas and inspiration, David stood on the center's steps with Jenny and Rose, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. The town had changed in the past year. New businesses had opened, houses were being repaired, and a sense of hope had replaced the despair that had once hung over Cedar Grove. "Think they understood what we were trying to show them?" Jenny asked. David smiled, remembering his own journey from megachurch pastor to community servant. "Some did," he replied. "Others will need time to discover it for themselves. Real change can't be taught in a seminar. It has to be experienced." Rose patted his arm affectionately. "The light showed us the way that night," she said. "But it's the daily choice to walk in that light that makes the difference." As darkness fell, the community center remained alive with activity. A recovery meeting in one room, a family dinner in another, teenagers helping elderly residents with computer skills in the education center. The building hummed with the sound of authentic ministry in action. David's journey had come full circle, but it wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of a new chapter, not just for him, but for a movement that was rediscovering the true meaning of ministry. The miracle at Cedar Grove had sparked a renewal that continued to spread, touching lives and transforming communities in ways that no empire of wealth and influence ever could. The light that had guided them through the storm had done more than save lives. It had illuminated a path back to authentic faith, not just for David, but for everyone who witnessed it. And in Cedar Grove, that light continued to shine, not as a miraculous glow, but in the transformed lives and renewed spirits of a community that had discovered what true ministry looked like. What touched you most about this story of redemption? Was it the mysterious light that guided rescue, the power of second chances, or perhaps the transformation of a small, struggling community into a beacon of hope? Have you ever witnessed or experienced a moment of divine intervention that changed everything? Or perhaps you've seen how authentic community can heal broken lives? Leave a comment below. Your insight could be the spark that ignites someone else's